Hi everyone, welcome to Unit 12, which is a wrap up on the course. It shouldn't take too long, but it's a step in the process I like to include. So one thing I did want to go was to guide you and go through the media sources very quickly. There are so many of them because we've accumulated them over several years of offering this course, and I know you can. I give you a lot of flexibility. You can pick and choose the ones that you want. So I did want to still, as we close up, go through the Moodle page very quickly and just highlight the ones that I find you cannot avoid so that you can maybe go back to them if you've not gone back to them. Doesn't mean that you have to critique them or use them in assessment, but it's still important to highlight the ones that really are almost sort of unavoidable when we look um, at what we've discussed in the class. So Unit 1, I wouldn't say that there's really any essential ones. In Unit 2, there's two pieces which are longer and you've probably avoided, but I think the two that I call the Tale of Two Cities and then Race Class Segregation in 60 Years After Brown. I think they both talk to the same issue of continual racial segregation, despite the legal protections that are in place to avoid overt segregation. They're very important, and they go well with the film that I recommend that you watch, which you have access to because of this course, Teach Us All. And avoid thinking it's just about the US because we have very similar issues in certain areas of Toronto, certainly Cole Harbour in Nova Scotia. So that racial segregation through housing is actually something that happens in Canada a lot, in Calgary as well. It may not be with African Canadian population, but you have very similar issues around segregation through housing and catchment with regards to South Asian population, etc. So definitely those three are well worth looking now that you have a bit more time to sort of relax. In Unit 3, the CBC piece on the Quebec Tree hip hop information. So everything that turns around the Niwijian project and the use of hip hop in film that led to the Niwijian formation, but also to other projects. I think all of these pieces really I recommend that you have a look at them. Then the sources on Summerhill are very important because when we talk historically, sometimes of schools that focus on critical pedagogy being new or recent, it's important to realize that no, they've always been there. They've been around for at least 100 years. They're often discreet, below the radar. We don't talk about them in textbooks, but they are there. And so the Summerhill story and then the story of Neil really allows us to debunk that myth a little bit. And then the boy who did not want to learn, that's an important one too, right? When we look at the limitations of some of the issues around what can go wrong too, and a lot to discuss there. Looking ahead, Unit 4. There's the Harvey Middle School, but it's a very, very short, and I've actually posted a longer piece in one of the forums, placed from the New York Times. I think the Harvey School is really worth looking at, particularly when we think about critical theory versus postmodern approach in critical pedagogy. Do we want segregated schools to protect youth that are LGBTQ+, or should we avoid that and actually focus on the mainstream aspect? So an important one there. And I think in Unit 4, the issue around Black children and hairstyles, this has been, we haven't talked about it much in the course, but it's been a huge form of discrimination and a form of re-empowerment, both. So whether it's that specific media piece or you're looking at others, but this is a theme that you should definitely explore because it's very contemporary. And if you look at the UK and the US, there's been some absolutely disastrous incidents in schools regarding oppression, marginalization through the imposition of dress codes and haircut codes that actually automatically marginalize youth, minority youth. In Unit 5, the fusing poetry and the spoken word is quite strong. The signing babies one, I think, is very important. TED and deaf kids, one message is very important. We haven't talked much about deafness. I know some of you have picked it up as your own project. deafness is a unique population within which to look at critical pedagogy, because as opposed to other impairments, deafness, the deaf community really represents a community that sees itself primarily as a culture, a subculture that is marginalized and oppressed, and refuses the notion, the deficit view that that these people just need to be fixed, particularly with cochlear implants, and really see themselves as the members and the bearers and the perpetuators of a community and a culture that is oppressed and marginalized. And so it's really interesting to always go back in terms of sociological outlook to look at the views and the perspectives of the deaf community, because there's a lot it can teach us about that political dimension, seeing things through a political lens rather than deficit lens, and also in terms of re-empowerment, creating spaces where people are affiliated with community, have a strong sense of identity, gain a voice, etc. And the Dennis Smith TED Talk is extremely important. So there are a lot there in Unit 5 that are really important. It's really important too. They terribly connected to the unit where we talked about critical digital literacies and new literacies, and the use of new literacies in critical pedagogy. The deaf space at Gallaudet University again connects to that topic on the deaf community and its re-empowerment. That's very important. The Little Fires Everywhere, I didn't create a thread for that one. It's a book that's interesting because of the theme about single mothers and the the outlook of race on certain issues to do with child welfare, etc. And it's set in an environment that is supposedly liberal and progressive, and then this unpacks suddenly, and you actually see that even if on the surface you have a suburbia or a community or an environment that is actually looks progressive, often it can hide fairly vicious oppression and marginalization in people's deeply ingrained biases. So both the book and the other source is interesting. Disability to white, I think, is extremely important to make us realize that although we talk about intersectionality, often that's missing, and that people still can be oppressed within a minority community or minority discourse. So it's very important that we look at that. True grit is an important one we haven't discussed much, but it's a really an acid test often in a course when we look at the true grit, because half the class normally is in awe and loves it, half the class is extremely concerned and worried and doesn't feel it's aligned with critical pedagogy. So the thing behind true grit is to realize that true grit was aligned with critical pedagogy originally, because true grit is a concept that really emerges from a body of literature which we call urban education. Urban education is a euphemism for a community of scholars who look basically at schools in the US that are in a city, working socially, economically deprived areas, dealing with lots of criminality, substance abuse, etc. Within this environment, in the 70s and 80s, a lot of African American teachers started using grit with African American students. And the thought behind it was really, first of all, an acknowledgement of the extreme marginalization oppressions that these students face, and a recognition that really they have very few opportunities for growth, employment, social promotion, that really everything is against them from the start. But that in this environment, the sports teams normally were doing well. And so it became an objective and an intention for these African American teachers to say, well, maybe if we use some of the techniques that are being used on the football field, on the basketball court, where these kids are getting re-empowered despite it all, we could import this into the classroom and take a similar approach of coaching. Coaching being a discourse that starts by saying, everything is against you. Yes, this is tough. Yes, this is very hard, but you can re-empower yourself and with effort put yourself through this, even if all the odds are against you. So there was a very, very strong critical pedagogy flavor there of re-empowerment through resilience. The problem with the segment that you have there is that, as it happened often, as in many contexts, things get reappropriated by groups that don't actually have the right intention. So to talk about true grit now in middle class environments, affluent neighborhoods and stuff is absolutely absurd and ridiculous, because you've just taken this concept on a tangent that means that it really has lost all context and all relevance, and becomes truly absurd. So that piece is easy to put back into context when you look at the history. Yes, originally very much aligned with critical pedagogy because it acknowledged oppression, marginalization in those environments, and then really offered a form of empowerment for these students, through all these obstacles and the odds being against them. But now it's being used in environments where that's not the case. So it really doesn't relate sorry, to critical pedagogy anymore. And the school to prison pipelines, both of these sources there are very important, so I hope you've seen them. The Neil Hilburn, The Future, is very important. We talked about poetry slams. It's one that makes me laugh all the time. There's probably no group as discriminated and stigmatized and discriminated against and stigmatized than individuals with mental health. And it's someone affected by mental health who empowers themselves through poetry, and it's both funny and extremely powerful, and it's lovely to watch. So I do hope you get to watch that one. In Unit 6, again, the CBC and Queen Nations Hip Hop Initiative relates to the same wide effort that connects eventually to Niwijan and the creation of Niwijan, etc. So I hope you had a look at the context and the website. The TED Talk on Nicole Maines on transgender students, who explains what needs to happen in school, is very powerful in terms of re-empowerment with relation to sexual orientation and gender. So I hope you did get to watch that. That's one that was added by students, and it's very, very powerful. In Unit 7, Mom, I'm Not a Girl is an extremely important video, so I hope you did get to watch that one. And when you watch it, think about the skills that mother demonstrates and displays, and think about how we need to work on self as teachers and educators to be able to display or demonstrate similar skills. And it's quite hard because she has a huge and subtle understanding of the complexity of what's happening there. Building the prison to social justice pipeline is an interesting piece as a follow-up from the school to prison pipeline, because it talks about restorative justice. You have one of your team members has done assignment 6 on restorative justice, so it's a good sort of segue into it. In Unit 8, restoring justice to safer school, again, is a piece on restorative justice. Those are definitely worth having a look at. Why we need more minority teachers is an important piece that relates to the discussion we've had about whether we need to have experienced the same marginalization oppression as our students to be able to create the right climate and rapport for the implementation of critical pedagogy. So you can, we said it was moot, but you can relate it back to that debate. The deaf body in public space from the New York Times is going to be interesting too. Again, the deaf community, I think you see on deafness and deaf community is always going to be really great for critical pedagogy, because you always have that political cultural dimension, which directly leads you into critical pedagogy. In Unit 9, you have the piece Examine Life by Judith Butler, which is really interesting if you're looking at disability through a social model disability lens, so through a postmodern lens, which becomes very important in critical pedagogy. Finding shelter outside a classroom, very important. We don't talk enough about homelessness and poverty. Most campuses in North America have a homeless population. When I worked in McGill, we knew they were there. They lived on the hill in a tent. They showered in the gyms, and they slept sometimes in winter in the labs. It's not because you are in a selective university or on a campus that you don't suffer from socioeconomic marginalization. So an important topic to open up for discussion and to acknowledge, and then to address through critical pedagogy. In Unit 10, Hip Hop, Race and Pedagogy is a bit old as a clip, but it's really useful. In a few minutes, it summarizes how hip hop can be useful. In Unit 11, The Lana Vatkovsky, one of the two directors that did The Matrix, since we talk about the Matrix all the time as being Matrix One as being a film that really makes explicit references to critical pedagogy, particularly with the choice, right? The pill, this pill or that pill. Do you want to continue being, passive, or do you want that act of conscientization, however painful it is, but see the world as it is? And often people say, "Are we projecting too much on the Matrix?" Well, when you see her story as a as a transgendered person, you can quickly see that really this is not just accidental, but there's a whole reflection that happens there. So it's a very, very important sort of segment. If you've not watched it, it's a bit long, but it's really useful because also she talks about that connection, overlap, intersection between private lives and public lives, and to what extent do we need to use our lived experience and share it and out ourselves if we can make a change for the world. And that's really important when we talked about amplifying our learners' voice and connecting them with community. It's difficult to connect people with community unless we have advocates that do that, right? So that's where that piece fits in, and it's important. Femi Fox is quite interesting because it's important to think about in terms of representation, in literature, and in games, etc. In early childhood, particularly, how can we create voices that allow for dialogical education in early childhood, and those resources are going to be very important. So definitely have a look at it. And in Unit 12, the last unit, the loophole allows discrimination against students with autism. I think it's important because we can get very complacent sometimes that in global north countries where we have legislation for equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, or in schools legislative provisions that secure inclusive provisions, we can be very quick to be complacent and say, okay, there's no problem here. But as we've seen, inclusion in itself is not enough. It doesn't have that political dimension. And here we see that really there are lots of loopholes around the legislation, hence the need to be more political and engage politically to be able to re-empower students, even or despite the legislative provisions sometimes failing. Overrepresentation of minorities in special education, it's an easy little piece that leads you into a huge body of work because when you work on critical pedagogy, often you are looking at this, of the fact that really um, there's an overrepresentation, for example, of racialized minorities in special ed, and it goes against any sort of scientific possibility because those numbers are incredibly high, and it leads you to really to think of the fact that often when we can't deal with race, or we can't deal with culture, or we can't deal with indigeneity in mainstream schools, we're very quick to jump the gun and say there's a problem here, it's an impairment, and use a deficit model. So that piece is very important because again, that really indicates a marginalization and oppression in a subtle, inconspicuous way, right? We say that we're helping, but we're really pushing the students and labeling as being special needs when they really are not. It's just that we don't know how to deal with another culture or another race, etc. That's about it. I just did want to go through this quickly because there's a lot of them, but those are the really ones that are very important. So even if you didn't comment on them, I really recommend that you go through them and that you have a quick look because that'll really complement the learning that you've done on this course. Recapping on the objectives, so if we go back to when we started, the first objective was to explore the theoretical foundations of critical pedagogy and examine contemporary embodiment in K-12 and post-secondary education. We did that in class 1 and 2. To recognize the implementation of critical pedagogy in contemporary setting, we did that in class 3, and then you're doing this in assignment 4 and 6. To explore the notion of critical voice and the educator's role in amplifying the learner identity, we did that in class 7. And the practical example that both your friends were able to do as a live sort of as a recording of a live interaction for which they had not prepared on purpose to have something really authentic and spontaneous was really well done and show you some of the tension that can exist in creating that rapport. The fourth objective was to explore the education's notion of self within critical pedagogy and the work on self and repercussions on classroom practices. We did that in Unit 10. And you are going to obviously reflect on this a lot in your final blog, because you're looking at your own experiences, potential experiences, your willingness to embrace critical pedagogy, or some of your resistance at this stage. So obviously, maybe some of that work is painful or difficult at this time, or not possible to schedule in this time of your career. So you may want to talk about it. And the last objective was to examine critical pedagogy from an international lens and explore diversity in this discourse on a global scale, and we did that in class 11. I have yet to go and see your postings for 11. I know you're a bit rushed with your assignments, but I hope you get a chance to at least read one of the articles and then to present it to your team so that they have a good overview of the 8 pieces. My reflection on this course, so it's a, unit 12 is a time for reflection and wrap up. So you do yours in the blog, I do mine here. The complexity of critical pedagogy and the theoretical complexity that goes with it is challenging to offer in a short time. Some of you in the midpoint debrief said, this is really tough in 6 weeks. I'm well aware that it's very tough in 6 weeks. Unfortunately, because of the sort of neoliberal approach to teaching in all faculties around Canada and North America, we try and make courses more and more appealing, more and more accessible, and that often means making them shorter and shorter. It's one of the ones that's a little hard to squeeze into 6 weeks, and I think you all know you would have gained from doing this over 12 weeks, and I'm fully aware of that, but it's something we don't have control over. It's tempting to want to model critical pedagogy, but at the same time, sometimes it's hard in 6 weeks. Again, I would have more opportunities to model it more if we'd had 12 weeks. In 6 weeks, there are some constraints there that can limit how much I can attempt to model during the 6 weeks. So bear with me on that point. It's a rich course at Teach because many questions start emerging while unpacking the course. For me, that means, am I being too directive? Should be 2 O's there, too directive. Am I forcing learners to do things in a certain way, squashing voices? Am I buying into an institutional hierarchical system of power and privilege, particularly with regards to grading? Who am I to purport to teach on marginalization oppressions while I'm enjoying so many privileges from affiliation with so many hegemonic groups? As I said at the beginning, white, male, and able-bodied, etc. It's problematic, right? You probably don't feel me being too torn, because I've taught this course again, I think close to 10 times. At the beginning, it was very painful, because I think when you teach the first time, a lot of these questions are there. As you go along, you make your peace with it. Doesn't mean that they leave my mind, but just means that I've gone through them and try and answer those questions with myself as I taught them the first few times. And I see the contradiction sometimes and some of the tension, but we have to make it work. I've taught this course with classrooms on the global perspective stream, with classrooms that were almost entirely made up of international students. This becomes very interesting. Now, that's not the case here, but I think it's important to still, share that experience with you. And there, when we get to Unit 12, there is, or Unit 11, there's always a real contradiction there when I talk to students who, universities have attracted through marketing to this environment. And then when we unpack all this, everything we talked about in terms of decolonization, critical pedagogy on a global scale being about decolonization of the curriculum, they haven't that conscientization. It happens in the course, and it's very dramatic to see. And it leads to a lot of painful sort of reconsideration. Sometimes, why am I here? Why did I do this? Why am I spending all this money to be here in a colonial sort of curriculum where that work isn't really attempted? So maybe we're missing this in this class, but be aware that when you teach critical pedagogy with international students in the classroom, that becomes very, very personal and authentic. So you will be drawn to do your own reflection on the course in the blog, obviously. Be aware, be careful as a caveat. Sometimes students rush through this and just say, okay, yes, this is what I've learned. It should be authentic on many levels. Particularly at the end, I don't in this course expect at all people to say, I'm walking away and I'm going to do this. I've explained to you this very well at the beginning that I could teach a course on inclusion and say to everyone, you must do this. I can teach a course on action research and say, this is something you can all do. I don't teach a course on critical pedagogy and finish by saying you should all do this. There are some limitations that can have to do with your own precariousness of employment, issues with your leadership not being on board, issues with your handling of risk, or being comfortable with risk, your level of comfort with Marxist theory generally, and the desire to change the world. Um, Also, your level of experience in the profession. You may be at a point where you say, this is something I'd like to do, but not at this stage. I need to develop, again, as we've seen, my ability to create rapport, my connection with marginalized youth before I can get to that stage where I felt comfortable actually implementing some of that. So I think the last blog can be really interesting because it can be highly personal and highly authentic. You don't have to just, you know, toe the line and say, this is fine, I'll do this. I think it's totally fine to write an end blog that says, I've taken this away, taken this away, taken this away, but I can't implement much of this for these reasons. So I'm yawning away. It's 2 in the morning again. And reflect about the evolution of your own learning as well with regards to autonomy reflection on these difficult topics. I'm well aware when I start this course. I've written a paper about this. I've taught this course so many times. I've written a paper about this, which is not published yet, but it's been brewing for a while and is ready to go to a journal, about the difficulty of teaching critical pedagogy in a condensed online format. There's an inherent contradiction here because my view anyway is that, we present and purpose online education more and more within the parameters of neoliberal environment. So it has to be accessible, it has to be fast, it has to be light, it has to be almost done in a distance education mode, right, where you can become completely independent and not actually interact much. And I do feel all this, right? So I've forced you to do 15 minutes meeting with me. There's a lot of activities in the course that have forced you to be online, to be present, encourage you to be present synchronously. I think it's very, very difficult to do critical pedagogy online, not because the online format doesn't lend itself to it, but because of the way we market and we sell online education. And so this is a big problem, I think, for faculties of education and for academia generally, that as we move towards blended and fully online models, we sometimes package them or present them and market them in a way that um, sort of assumes that these tough and rich and problematic dialogical moments will not happen. But you can't teach this course without doing it. So thanks for bearing with me. I know there's an inherent contradiction, and particularly when it comes halfway, that you've sometimes gone through courses where none of these elements were required, and then this course comes along and forces you to challenge your views, challenge your habits, challenge your preferences. But really, we can't really model or really think deeply about critical pedagogy if we just see this as a distance course where you're all autonomous and doing this in your own time, just doing the readings and posting. It doesn't work. It requires that dialogical piece. So bear with me. When I feel the tension, I don't see it as something personal at all because I understand that you're transitioning. Again, I've talked often about transitional friction. You're transitioning into a class that asks you to do things that you've not been asked to do before. But hopefully, as you move forward into the masters, you'll return to this and see the value of having this course there and of it forcing you to get out of your zone of comfort. Because really, that's what critical pedagogy is about, and it needs that reflection needs to be experiential. You need to experience it and feel it to feel both the benefits and the difficulty of that process of I wouldn't say conscientization. I don't know if we've had time to do conscientization, but at least for you to realize some of the limitations of what we do sometimes in online education and to challenge some of that and to try and do things differently. Staying in touch and important social media and presence in the field. It's very the social media platforms are a very comfortable place to continue discussions around critical pedagogy because it is very easy to connect with like-minded people who focus on it. And there's not that much of it around. You've seen there's not that much literature, but there are quite a few very important people who are online. And so it's an organic process. It won't happen overnight, but if you do get on social media platforms and start connecting to people who do this kind of work, you will see that you're growing your network, you're getting aware of conferences and events and online sort of get together. And that's what's going to allow you to continue that reflection, that exploration of it in the long term. because often it's a given that you may work in a community, you may work in a school, you may work in a region where no one's doing this work. So the importance of connecting beyond your community, beyond your province, sometimes beyond your country is really, really important. And there's a rich community of people that do this sort of work. So do use it. Social media is almost easier for this purpose than just using journals and just connecting through other people's readings. I'm certainly happy to remain connected with you and to continue these conversations. And sometimes students after this course do come back a year and a half later and say, by the way, can we continue this conversation? I think this is really great. This is really what critical pedagogy is about. So I don't use Facebook for work, but I do use ResearchGate, LinkedIn, Twitter, academy.edu. There's a messaging function on any of these, so feel free to connect with me, follow me. We can follow each other, and then we can connect later through the messaging function if you have questions, etc. I would be more than happy to. I will see this as part of the job of teaching courses like this. So it's been really lovely seeing you for 6 weeks. I too would prefer 12 weeks. I too would prefer face to face. We work again in a landscape that's not of our own making, and we are not in a vacuum. We function in an environment, so we have to make do with what is out of our control and directed by powers that be. But I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we can enjoy a really packed course like this on a 6 week basis, while we're trying to get holidays and do work for a lot of you, etc. But I hope that it has put you in touch with certain key authors, giving you access to some key resources, triggered some key reflection about some important sort of concepts in the classroom practices and equity. And that you've got a network and that you can come back to the network if you have further questions. So bye for now, and then maybe tomorrow I will see. It's still Friday here, so maybe tomorrow Saturday. It's morning here too. Actually, it's still morning, but maybe in a few hours there'll be some of you online if you have further questions, etc. Otherwise, I wish you a good end of the course and a good end of summer, and maybe we'll see some of you along the way. Speak soon.